Thank you, Angela, for the recap of last week's lessons around the marble jar, and to also explain to us how trust can be viewed as the fuel for every relationship, that none of us could run on an empty tank or zero charge for those who are driving electric cars like myself. Adrienne Marie Brown phrased it most succinctly when she said, "We could only move at the speed of trust." Similarly, the reading that Morar brought us earlier about mycelium mushrooms. Are we doing an M alliteration today? Talk about mice and mycelium mushrooms, right? Indicating that the amount of courage and trust it takes to sustain all of life involves not just their relationship with the trees, but also the entire ecosystem. So indeed, all of us run on this fuel that we call trust. Can human beings similarly exhibit the same amount of courage and bravery as the mice and the mycelium mushrooms? As promised, we're going to dive deeper today into Brene Brown's Anatomy of Trust by breaking down the first three letters of braving. So that would be B, R, and A, beginning with the letter B, which stands for boundaries. Now, I already touched on this a couple of weeks ago when I talked about saying yes and saying no. Remember those wine glasses? Yeah, a couple of you do. And even if you don't, just nod your head and pretend like you remember them. They were a way to illustrate how to consolidate our resources and make our yeses more powerful by saying no to a few things, which is again what I love about Nidra Tawwab's reading earlier today when she went over a few no's before she got to the yeses. That it matters who we spend our time with, not with those dementors, soul-sucking type of people, but with folks that actually bring us energy and bring us life. How do we say yes to that? And it also matters how and where we spend time with these people. Now, a couple of holidays ago, I was visiting my parents and I made the mistake of staying with them. Now, of course, the dynamics are odd enough when you sleep in your childhood bedroom that has been turned into a museum of sorts, right? And of course, they still call it your bedroom, even though you haven't slept in it for a gazillion years. So it kind of feels like somehow when you go back, you also go back in time. And sometimes you get stuck in that parent-child relationship. And as one could probably imagine, the conversations and expectations also felt like they were stuck back in time. Without getting into the gory details, let's just say that things did not turn out all well and not the way that I expected it to. It was not a happy holiday cheer that was brought to me that year, and it devolved into conflict. And realizing I couldn't do anything to change their minds, I at least made it clear to myself and to them what my boundaries were. And I was so glad that during this trip, I listened in my Audible to Tawab's book. It came at just the right time because it was so reassuring to hear from her when she mentioned that relationships with our parents and drawing boundaries to them are the hardest out of all the different relationships that we have. Can I get an amen from somebody out there, right? Who's ever had to draw boundaries with your parents? You realize how difficult that is because you've had years of training and indoctrination about how you're supposed to behave in front of them and how you're supposed to obey your parents. And that is indeed the longest relationship we've probably had. And so it's really difficult to draw boundaries with your parents. So after that experience and after that conflict, my boundary then became figuring out what to say yes to, and more importantly, what to say no to, so that my relationship with them would actually turn into one of trust. And it eventually became figuring out how I would respect their boundaries and they would respect mine. These days, or I should say, right after that event and right after reading Tawab's book, I now stay at a hotel whenever I visit them. And that has saved me not a ton of money, but a ton of grief and a ton of trying to figure out how to navigate my way around the holidays. So it's actually what saved the holidays for me. Boundaries. How do we practice that? Yes, not just with our parents, but siblings count as well. I want to talk next about reliability. And in order to illustrate this, please allow me to read you my own article from Leader Lab, which is found on the UUA site, which Matt has pasted in the chat box. The title of this article is How to Start a Racy Conversation. And at first, so here's what the article says. At first glance, it seemed like the evening news did a good job of covering this year's Pride Parade. After all, the minister of the Unitarian Universalist congregation of any town was given a 10-second soundbite, and they even spelled her name right. However, no one watching was really able to identify the involvement of the rest of the congregation because they were marching and waving behind the grand marshal of the parade. And the camera then eventually zoomed in on a Chihuahua sporting a rainbow-colored vest. That Chihuahua became the star of the show. There was nothing that indicated who this group of people were, what congregation they were marching with, or who they were or where they were from. What happened? Well, earlier that morning, Fred left the banners and signs at the church, thinking that Norma, the chair of the Social Action Committee, was actually going to pick them up. Norma, however, thought that Mary, who was chair of the Communications Committee, was the one that was going to bring up the banners and the signs and bring it to the parade, because after all, the Communications Committee was the one that worked on the messaging to make sure that everything was consistent. Thus, 40 people from the congregation became anonymous marchers and blended right in with the rest of the crowd. Now, that may or may not have been based on a true story where the names have been changed to protect anonymity, right? This was not just a story about who was responsible, accountable, consulted, or informed, as the article eventually goes on to explain. But for me, it's also one about reliability. If your name is Fred and you committed to doing something, then you should just do it. And if something comes up last minute, which sometimes it does, right? We know that stuff happens. Well, then let others know about it. We have so many forms of communication these days, texting, phoning and emailing, sending smoke signals or those homing pigeons, whatever mechanism for communication. We could do that these days, right? But for me, sometimes it has to do with the difference between being wholehearted and being half-assed, right? About our commitments and what we say yes to. If I can't rely on you, then it's difficult for me to build trust with you. Isn't that the bottom line? So, you know what? My admonition and my Advice for you is no ghosting allowed. We save ghosting for Halloween, right? Anyway, sorry, bad pun. The last letter I want to convey today is A for accountability. We all make mistakes, like I just did with copying and typing up the reading today. But how we recover and how we make amends makes all the difference in the world. As I mentioned last week, but didn't go into details because it was a multi-generational service, we can't just point fingers and say that clergy misconduct only took place in the Catholic Church. Believe it or not, 70, as in 70% of our congregations are what's considered after pastor congregations, meaning that there has been some form of sexual, financial, substance abuse, or other forms of misconduct that has taken place. The shorthand, we call it after pastor, is because it's after a pastor has misconducted in that congregation. And what happens after is for those of us who follow that minister, it becomes that much harder to rebuild trust because then all of us get lumped into the category of ministers who cannot possibly be trusted. In my previous role, I should say, as Ministerial Credentialing Director for the UUA, it was really heartbreaking for me to sit in on those cases of misconduct. Again, a lot of them had to do with ministers who had poor boundaries. So in a sense, all these letters are interrelated, boundaries and reliability and so on and so forth. And the biggest factor I found that helped in terms of the healing process goes beyond punishing those perpetrators and removing their credentials from them. But it had to do with how the entire system could actually hold each other mutually accountable. Let me give you just one example of, again, another congregation who has had a history of sexual misconduct by their minister. It literally caused a split in that congregation, and another congregation was formed as a result. And for a while, that congregation became known as a clergy killer congregation because the congregation then distrusted any minister that came after, and their ministries became extremely short-lived. And they also repelled not just ministers, but also newcomers, because newcomers and new members were not to be trusted either. And people could sense, those newcomers could sense that there was something that happened in that congregation. It was almost like part of the air that they were breathing, and it existed in the walls of those congregations. And the congregation itself, some knew about the misconduct and what actually happened, and others did not. And as we know, secrecy also takes on a life of its own. And I'm not talking about confidentiality, which is actually healthy. According to the Reverend Nell Newton, privacy is held to protect dignity, confidence is held to protect the vulnerable, and secrets are held to protect the powerful. I'm going to paste that in the chat box because I think those words are extremely poignant, because secrets were kept to consolidate power to just the ones who were in the know. So what happened to this congregation was eventually they hit rock bottom and decided they wanted to try to do something different in order to become healthier. So they experimented with what was known as, and is still known actually, as developmental ministry. Now, developmental ministry is something that is similar to interim ministry, but instead of just 2 years, that minister had 4 to 6 years to work on clearly developed developmental goals over that period of 4 to 6 years. because as sociologists will say, it takes that amount of time in order for meaningful cultural change to take place. Rebuilding trust, not surprisingly, was one of those goals. And during this period of time, the congregation came up with a really clear, safe congregation policy. And also, they started doing some truth telling, and they told their stories of what happened in an open and public way. The story of the misconduct even made it to their history book, so to speak. And they retold that history every time a new membership class is held. Some of you may be thinking, oh my gosh, have they no shame? Why would you air your dirty laundry like that in front of newcomers? Nonetheless, again, according to Brene Brown, the difference between guilt and shame is that guilt means I did something bad, and shame means I'm a bad person. And this congregation wanted to make it clear that they were not a bad congregation and that what happened was nothing to be ashamed about. And on the other hand, for the newcomers, it was actually quite refreshing to come into a new environment and to a church where they were so open and honest and bold about what happened. So consequently, believe it or not, their membership grew as a result of this truth telling and as a result of rebuilding trust amongst themselves and with future ministers. Having an open process for accountability and having clear boundaries creates a sense of safety much faster than blaming, shaming, and denial ever can. Again, we all make mistakes. How can we ask for forgiveness and engage in the reparative process? That's the better question to ask in my mind. And what mechanisms do we have in place to make sure that we are holding each other accountable for our actions? Consider areas today where you might be able to draw some healthier boundaries to get to a stronger yes, so that you will become more reliable, not just once, but over and over again. How might better boundaries lead you to find peace and safety in your life? To whom are you accountable to? Let's take a moment to sit with all these questions because those are only the first three letters of this Braving acronym. There are so many more issues and places that we could help build trust. For now, let's take a few deep breaths together and sit in this moment of reflecting on trust.